We finally arrived. We are at the end of this work. Johannes Climacus de Omnibus Datium Est. We are finally here in the second part, outside of our introductions, and ready for this question of what is it to doubt? And indeed, if it's necessary for you to doubt to be a philosopher, this is also the question of what is it to be a philosopher? What is the relation between these two? And how is it that we should proceed with our understandings of Kierkegaard's, or at least Johannes's, notion of philosophy and its relation to doubt and the broader philosophical systems? So, what is it to doubt? What must the nature of existence be in order for doubt to be possible is the first real theme of this, and everything else kind of grows out of this. We have a subtitle once in this work, right? One little subsection, and yet it doesn't continue with the second. We can see again that this is just a narrative account, and the story will continue on in one way or another. So let us begin the ending here. As Johannes began his deliberation on this question, he of course perceived that if he demanded an empirical answer to it, life would offer a multifariousness that would only hide a perplexing diffusion over the whole range of extremes. In other words, not only could that which evokes doubt in the single individual be extremely different, but it could also be the opposite. For if someone were to disclose on doubt in order to arouse doubt in another, he could perceivably thereby evoke faith, just as faith, conversely, could evoke doubt. The idea of, here, no, you got to believe this. Sometimes people are going to go, no, I deny that. Or you can't believe this is true, and you hear it and you go, actually, I think I do believe that's true. Right? That faith and doubt are both the same sort of process, that you can't simply give doubt to somebody else. You might seed some issues of doubt, but your doubt doesn't automatically equate to somebody else's doubt or your faith to their faith. Because of this paradoxical dialectic, which, as he had realized earlier, had no analogy in any sphere of knowledge, since all knowledge stands in direct and imminent relation to its object and the knower, not in an inverse and transcendent relation to a third, but easily perceived, at this point any empirical observation would lead to nothing. You can't simply observe the nature of one thing or another and get your conclusion, is what Kierkegaard is saying here. He had to take another route if he sought to find an answer to that question. He had to search out doubt's ideal possibility in consciousness, your relation to doubt, and what this means. This, of course, had remained the same, however different the occasioning phenomena was, since it, without itself being explained by the phenomena, explained the effect of the phenomena. But this relation to it explains the wider system. And in this way, your doubting is an effort that's going to be done for all people, that this is the way you're going to understand this. And we can kind of see hints of what Sartre would be arguing about later, in addressing how existentialism is a humanism, that in fashioning myself I fashion all of mankind, and other ideas of existentialism that's going to be played out by others. And that this idea that regardless of how different the occasioning phenomena was, it itself explains the phenomena. That it, by doing so, even if it's different by many, is this same task of understanding, and therefore becomes what it is for everybody. Then whatever produced doubt in the individual could be as different as it pleased. If this possibility were not the individual, nothing would be able to evoke it. Moreover, since the difference of the occasioning phenomenon could be of the contrary, the possibility would have to be total, essential for human consciousness. He then sought to orient himself as it is in himself, which explains every specific consciousness, yet without being itself a specific consciousness. Like, what is it that causes us to be conscious of something, even though it's different in all of us. He asked what the nature of consciousness would be when it had doubt outside of itself. There is consciousness in the child, but this has doubt outside of itself. How then is a child's consciousness qualified? It actually is not qualified at all, which can also be expressed by saying that it is immediate. Immediacy is precisely indeterminateness. Now, this is an interesting idea. When something is immediate, when it's right there, it's not mediated by anything. Immediate, right? That term. But rather it's just present. It's there, and therefore there's no consciousness of it. It's just present. It's not being mediated by thought. It's not in relation to anything. In immediacy, there is no relation. For as soon as there is a relation, immediacy is canceled. Immediately, therefore, everything is true. But this truth is untruth the very next moment. For in immediacy, everything is untrue. If consciousness can remain in immediacy, then the question of truth is canceled. This is, in some ways, a little confusing, and in other ways, perfectly clear. Immediately, everything is true. It's all possible, at least. And we approach it, first of all, as if it might be true, that we are going to, from our senses, experience and expect that it would be true. Then it's mediated. Then we reflect upon it. Then we have our consciousness in relation to this object that was beforehand present to us. We can see very clearly some parallels with notions of James and pragmatism, how something is true and then immediately untruth the next moment, how something can be true and we operate it as it is that way, but yet then abandon this idea. We can also see some parallels of Kierkegaard drawing on the work of people like Friedrich Schleiermacher and his notion of religion as absolute dependence. And this utter dependence on something is the truth, the outside object, and therefore immediately everything that's unknown, not familiar, another term for that could even be the notion of holiness, is what we're dependent upon before it's then mediated by our own presence. So then we are left with this other question of how does the question of truth arise? Where does truth come from, and how do we arise in this enter into our mind? By way of untruth. Because the moment I ask about truth, I have already asked about untruth. Right? We're already putting ourselves in relation to this object. And so when we're wanting to know truth, we're also wanting to know what's not true. What about this statement has facts in it and what doesn't? Is the chair I'm sitting in actually a chair or just a mental construct, an image of a chair held by me or by somebody else? I'm going to deny one assertion and hold and maintain another. Is that object a tree that I'm perceiving or simply a figment of my imagination? And is there a difference between a figment of my imagination of a tree and a tree? And is this thing a tree because it has notions of treeness, or is it simply a collection of sticks and branches and whatnot that we label a tree because it's effective to do so? And we can tie in immediately lots of different threads of things that we've addressed in this class already. Right, but the question of truth arises by the way of the untruth. Because when I ask about the truth, in that moment, I'm also asking about the untruth. I'm asking about what the nature of something actually is. In the question of truth, consciousness is brought in relation with something else. And what makes this relation possible is untruth. What makes your understanding of something possible, Kierkegaard, Johannes Climacus is saying, is the fact that you are now relating to it. You're reflecting on it. You're deciding, is this indeed true or not? Doubt has entered in. That is how it is now mediated by your consciousness. Which is first, immediacy or mediacy? Go ahead and stop and answer that question yourself. What's first, immediacy or mediacy? This is, of course, a capricious question. Reminded him of the response Thales is supposed to have given someone who asked whether night or day came into existence first. The answer was, of course, that night is one day earlier. Which is an odd sort of idea, right? That night is a day earlier. That night, of course, came first. Before there was light, there was dark. What came first, the chicken or the egg, the seed or the tree? This sort of question of, is it the source or is it the response? What's first then, of course, is not your consciousness. It's not your relation to the object, but the object itself. Of course, this is also leading us into that broader question between rationalism and empiricism. He continues there, cannot the consciousness then remain in immediacy? This is a foolish question, because if it could, there would be no consciousness at all. Right? What is your consciousness? It's not just in that event as it's happening, but it is your relation to that event. Therefore, it is mediated. But how then is immediacy actually canceled? By mediacy, which cancels immediacy by presupposing it. Right? It is mediated by your consciousness. You're the one who is now making something not immediate, but mediated. What then is immediacy? It is reality itself. That this is what we're trying to talk about. Immediacy is the reality around us, as opposed to your mediation within it. So, of course, if it's reality itself, it's also true. It's not based on perception. It's not based upon reflection. It's not based upon what you think something is. The world outside of you that is immediate to you is true, although it might be false or untruth the very next moment once it is mediated. Your perceptions, your senses, may be wrong, may be in error. Saja, the great Gaon within Jewish philosophy, said the same thing. That our senses can lie to us, and therefore other things have got greater truth to them. Relation to tradition and a priori conceptions of the world themselves, according to Saja, have greater value. The sophists amongst the Greeks have the thesis that everything is true. While Plato kind of fights against this, this was an argument that we addressed early on in the semester within Sophism. Of course, the sophists would maintain that everything is true, and also Gorgias, the great sophist, said that nothing exists. So, right, we have this weird sort of fun that the sophists can do everything, and it really kind of makes us think, if we're trying to be lovers of wisdom, then what is true and how are we going to look at it? His note also here includes Schleiermacher and the notion of feelings, as I mentioned earlier, that everything therefore is true and has this sort of beginning. And of course Aristotle interprets this notion also about everything being true or not as that everything is indeed true, is also mentioned in this footnote. That we have a relation to everything around us is, first of all, just the case. It's reality. But then what does this mean moving forward? It's in relation to you that we have this difficulty. This, of course, is going to be placing Kierkegaard along the sides of the rationalists, that there are truths that exist before your sense experience, as opposed to everything being derived from your sense experience itself. And so we're at least kind of hedging our bet towards the Descartes side of things instead of towards the Hume side of things, having already rejected idealism, at least in the form of Hegel, while might having some ground still in compromise of Kant, But otherwise, the Hegelian system of just jumping in and not doubting is going to be something rejected at this point, according to Kierkegaard. So what is immediacy? It is the word. Immediately, notice what we're saying here about immediacy is it's the word. Our ideas are mediated with the concepts themselves through words, through expressions of thoughts. We should be drawing some very clear connections here with Occam and notions of nominalism. Right? Nominalism, as it applies to Occam, means that the only things that are universal are spoken or written words and concepts. That things themselves are not universal, but everything is being mediated through our words, through our speeches. Climacus continues this by saying, how does the one cancel the other? By giving expression to it, for that which is given expression is always presupposed. We presuppose that something actually exists, and this is why we're saying anything about it. Now, this again is putting us within that whole debate between the rationalists on the one hand and the empiricists on the other hand. Right? The rationalists say that we have ideas existing before our experiences of that, and therefore if we're giving expression to something, if we're using words and language to mediate our experience of the actual things, then that means that we have some concepts that exist prior to our experience. And he continues, by giving expression to it, for that which is given expression is always presupposed. Everything that we're having words about presupposes the idea somewhere. Now again, this is based upon the real world around you, but it's not just through observation. This could also hint back to some other debates that we can see within Scotus and his notion of the univocity of being, right? The idea that the words which describe the properties of God mean the same thing when they apply to people or to things. And this debate also with the notion of the unicity of form, right? That applies to all substances that compose of matter and form. He continued with this discussion, right, that it may be formulated thus that whether in one individual remaining essentially one, there are many substantial forms or only one, right? And there's the idea of where the forms are and how this has, and this becomes key to the distinction between substances that exist excluding God and God, which excludes all other substances. And it's a distinction that was essential for Scotus, and we can kind of see some of this debate, just very briefly, with notions of nominalism and unicity of form and all of these other things being brought up with this idea of what we're presupposing when we're using language to mediate our experiences with the broader world around us. He continues, immediacy is reality. Language is ideality. Language contains the ideal, not necessarily the actual. Consciousness is contradiction, right? When we're conscious of an object and we're going to call it tree, we are mediating this object with the concept of treeness and whether or not it holds all of these qualities or not. And this is a key difference with Kierkegaard and others who have discussed this idea. That here we have the concept of tree, and we have an idea of treeness. And we're not saying that this exists in the realm of ideas, but that it exists in our minds prior to the actual experience of this tree. And that the word tree has certain ideas attached to it in our minds, in our own thoughts. And yet, when we see a tree, it doesn't match our expectation of that tree, our anticipation of what this tree would be. And off this very brief little paragraph, we can extend all sorts of different debates and tease lots of different things out. And I hope you're getting excited about, oh yeah, I could have talked about this, that, and the other, and oh, maybe I'll run with this idea or something else to these effects, right? This is the beginning of a lot of different discussions on scholarship. Even more so, he continues, that the moment I make a statement about reality, contradiction is present, for what I say is ideality. Language doesn't represent what really is. Language is about what you expect something to be. Now, this is also getting us to the heart of a distinction between atheistic and theistic existentialism. Right? The idea for both, say, Sartre and Kierkegaard is that we should have a union between essence and existence. Which one precedes the other is really the heart of the debate between these different schools of existentialism. For Kierkegaard, the essence of a thing should relate to its existence. The essence is already known before we even encounter the object itself. First, this is done through God, but it's also then done through our own minds as we relate to the broader world around us. So when I say tree, I've got an image of what a tree should be. And if you bring a sad, pathetic little stick, think Charlie Brown's Christmas tree sort of thing, right? We're all going to say, Charlie Brown, that's a horrible tree. That doesn't have the image of what I'm expecting out of a tree. Similarly, if we're standing in front of some other magnificent tree, we will say, now this is a tree. This has got what my concepts are about tree all wrapped up in it. This is a perfect tree. It's fulfilling the essence of tree. Its existence and essence are one. For Sartre, on the other hand, right, the idea is that your existence precedes your essence, and we've got this distinction between these two. That you're going to see something, and you're going to make it up, and then you're going to derive your ideas from it. So, while what we've been arguing here is Kierkegaard's notion, it's not necessarily the same thing that would apply to all existentialists. This is not a universally existentialist idea. We're seeing it drawn on and expounding notions of nominalism and some of the ideas that Scotus is addressing in the debate between empiricism and idealism and rationalism and all of these isms that we've been addressing in class, all these different schools of thought. But it's also the heart of the very distinction between different schools of existentialism. So moving past that first very weighty, very full, dense first paragraph where we have so many debates we can move in, he says that the possibility of doubt then lies in consciousness, whose nature is a contradiction that is produced by a duplexity, and that itself produces a duplexity. Right? The possibility of doubt, of engaging with ideas, then starts with you, again returning to that notion of the subjective. That there's a contradiction, there's a difference between what one's existence is and what one's essence is, and this division taking place in your mind. A duplexity of this sort inevitably has two manifestations, he continues. The duplexity is reality and ideality. Consciousness is the relation. I can either bring reality into relation with ideality or bring ideality into relation with reality. In reality, by itself, there is no possibility of doubt. When I express it in language, contradiction is present, these concepts that we've already just been addressing. Since I do not express it, but produce something else. Insofar as what was said is supposed to be an expression of reality. I have brought this into relation with ideality. When I'm saying something, I'm bringing the idea that I have, the essence of what it is, in many ways, into the reality of it, the existence of what it is. Insofar as what was said is something produced by me. Now again, you're the agent who does this. I brought ideality into relation with reality. You are always the beginning of this. It's always going to begin with Kierkegaard from the position of the subjective. That the truth of anything is always mediated through your experience of this and your expectations of it. So long as this exchange takes place without mutual contact, consciousness exists only according to its possibility. Now notice here there's this notion of mutuality, which we've talked about this idea a little bit before. The mutual encounter with the paradox of thought versus the non-mutual, the one that relates then in the learner being transformed from untruth to truth, from not to be, versus rejection of that. Once again, we can return to this earlier work with the notion of the moment and what that means. And this is the reason why we have these weighted words like a mutual encounter versus a non-mutual encounter. So long as this exchange takes place without a mutual contact, without this mutual encounter, consciousness exists only according to its possibility. In ideality, everything is just as perfectly true as in reality. In your mind, these two things exist perfectly the same. Go back to that illustration of Schrodinger's cat, right? Before we've opened up the box, the cat is both alive and dead. That both are simultaneously true because reality and ideality, until they've encountered each other, are both as equally possible. Going back to notions within pragmatism, that things are true just as much as they are possibly not true the very next moment. Therefore, just as I can say that immediately everything is true, so it can also say that immediately everything is actual. For not until the moment that ideality is brought into relation with reality does possibility appear. Right? Things are only possible when the ideal tree is there with the real tree. Other than that, the ideal tree exists, and is true, this notion of tree, along with the tree over there. It's only when they're brought together that it's possible that this is true or not true. In immediacy, the most false and the most true are equally true. Right? Before it's been mediated by a mind, both the most false and the most true are equally true. In immediacy, the most possible and the most impossible are equally actual. Until it's been mediated by you, until you, as the subject, engage with it. In many ways, this is almost converse of notions of nominalism, but we can leave that as an aside. So long as this exchange takes place without a collision, consciousness does not actually exist. And this colossal fallacy causes no annulments. As long as you're not thinking about it, as long as you're not engaging the idea with the real substance, there's no collision that's going to take place, and there's no truth or falsity, as it were. Everything is as equally true as it is potentially not true. Reality is not consciousness, ideality no more so. Yet consciousness does not exist without both, and this contradiction is the coming into existence of consciousness and is its nature. So notice here where we're at with this whole debate about your thoughts and where they come from and how they relate to the outside world. It's all coming through your perspective and your engagement with it. It's not that these things presuppose an existence one way or the other, but it's about how you approach them. These are two sides of one coin, as it were. Before proceeding any further, he considered whether or not what he, at this point, called consciousness was what usually was called reflection. Now, reflection becomes a key idea. We have a little asterisk, and you follow yourself to the bottom of 169, and you see the note that what he's explaining here is not without significance. That this term might be confusing, but it's essential to this debate. So what does Johannes do with this? He formulates the relevant definition as follows: that reflection is the possibility of the relation. Consciousness is the relation, the first form of which is contradiction. When you are conscious of it, the first thing you're going to do is create a contradiction between what it was possible and what things are. Your expectation versus reality. And again, we can even go back to people like Bonaventure and the whole idea of apprehension and what you're going to see with things, and the distinction that exists between what your thoughts of it are and what it actually is in reality. The microcosm that exists within you relating to the macrocosm that's outside of it. For example, he continues, ideality and reality, soul and body, to know the true, to will the good, to love the beautiful, God and the world, etc., are categories of reflection. And again, we can even pull back to notions of Kant here. And once we're talking about these as categories, we can think about Kant and his formulation of ideas and how we put these in different categories in our mind. In reflection, they touch each other in such a way that a relation becomes possible. When your image and thoughts of something touches the reality, these categories become troubled, and a relation between what you're mentally conceiving of an idea and what it actually is becomes possible. The categories of consciousness, however, he says, are trichotomous. A language also demonstrates, for when I say I'm conscious of this sensory impression, that I am expressing a triad. Consciousness is mind. And it is remarkable that when one is divided into the world of mind, there are three, never two. So what do we see here? Once we're looking at the mind, he's arguing that we actually have three different categories, not two. This is a pushback against Hegel. Once again, we see lots of these pushbacks against Hegel, right? Hegel with that whole master-slave image where you've got the consciousness of one object being conscious of the other consciousness, and this becomes the way you're being formed. But he's saying that what we really have is a triad, that there's three of these, not two. That consciousness, therefore, also presupposes a reflection, that we're looking back upon something, that it's not just a fight between these two different modes in our mind, but the relation extends further beyond that into also a reflection upon the outside world as well. Right? If this were not the case, then it would be impossible to explain doubt. That there's something weighted out within all of this. We're also making a strong connection to Kant and his whole notion of the mind being in relation to the phenomena and the phenomena that comes out of that. Once again, we have this triad, and we could highlight that distinction once more. Admittingly, language seems to conflict with this. For in most languages, as far as he knew, the term to doubt is related to the word to, duo, doubt, right? You can kind of see that. Yet he surmised that this merely suggested the presupposition of doubt, all the more since it was clear to him that as soon as I, as mind, become two, I am eo ipso three. Right? So again, we're adding in all of these extra layers just for fun, right? If there were nothing but dichotomies, doubt would not exist. For the possibility of doubt resides precisely in the third, which places the two in relation to each other. So it's not just master fighting against slave for one to presuppose something, but there is something weighing these other two as they're fighting and relating to one another. There's the mind, which is relating to noumena or phenomena, and mediating of what is it that you're perceiving from the actual object, and what is the object itself, and your mind in relation to that. So we're bringing both of these concepts together in this section here. We could not therefore say that reflection produces doubt. It's not necessary that doubt shows up simply by reflection. Again, you could try to get somebody to doubt something and they might have faith in it instead. Unless we were to express ourselves in reverse, we must say that doubt presupposes reflection, without, however, this prius being temporary. Doubt arises by way of a relation between these two. But this, to happen, the two must be. Yet doubt, which is a higher expression, proceeds and does not come afterwards. So doubt is in relation between ideality, the essence of a thing, and the existence of a thing. There is your mind. The noumena and the phenomena, there is your mind. The master and the slave, there is that which judges and doubts the relation between the two. Right? So again, we're drawing in both Hegel and Kant, depending on which examples we're trying to use. And this is producing this new triad that Kierkegaard is advancing is necessary with the relation of doubt. And in many ways expresses also how we get to know and understand the world around us. So key to this notion of doubt is clearly notions of reflection. It's at this point that you're engaging with these ideas. He continues that reflection is the possibility of the relation. It's also through reflection where you are able to relate to this object, doubt being one of the possible outcomes that can come about as a result of this. This can also be stated as follows. Reflection is disinterested. That's an odd idea. That reflection itself is not interested in it. And why? What does this mean? Consciousness, however, is the relation, and thereby is interest. A duality that is perfectly and with pregnant double meaning expressed in the word interest. Intisere, or being between. Right, so what are we seeing here? What are we going to draw from these terms? And what does he mean again? That when you reflect on something, you're not interested in it, but when you're conscious of it is when you are now interested in it. This seems to almost be standing over and against some of these earlier assumptions that he's been laying. So there must be different categories of knowledge and how we relate to things. He says, therefore, all disinterested knowledge, right, some things that you just know about but are not necessarily engaged in, things like mathematics, aesthetics, and metaphysics, is only the presupposition of doubt. As soon as the interest is canceled, doubt is not conquered, but is neutralized, and all such knowledge is simply a retrogression. You're not doubting mathematical proofs because you're not engaged in it, because it doesn't necessarily affect you and your senses and how you're looking about all that. All you're simply doing is regressing to that earlier standpoint of ideality instead of relation to this object as such. Thus, he says, it would be a misunderstanding for someone to think that doubt can be overcome by so-called objective thinking. Here's really what he's trying to get to, right? Going back to the idea of the subjective, to you. Objective thinking is relating to ideas as they exist outside of yourself. Subjective is how you approach them from your position. Doubt is a higher form than any objective thinking, for it presupposes the later, but has something more, a third, which is interest or consciousness. And who, of course, is the one with the interest in this is you. And therefore, objective is great, but really when you're engaged with it, you have this knowledge, this objective reality, and then you're relating to it, not just through reflection, which might just be over the objective reality, but your consciousness, and now you are putting yourself in relation to it. In this respect, he considered the conduct of Greek skeptics far more consistent than the modern overcoming of doubt. Right? That he likes the idea of what the skeptics were doing. Remember, what was the idea of the skeptics? The skeptics, following people like Pyrrho, said that the nature of the world around you is indeterminable, that you don't know anything, and therefore you should refrain from judgments. Not that there wasn't a reality, but that you wouldn't be able to determine it or know what it was. They were all well aware that doubt is based on interest, and therefore, with perfect consistency, they thought that they could cancel doubt by transforming interest into apathy. Instead of saying, I'm overly interested in the subject, I'm going to refrain from my engagement with it. I'm going to let it exist as it was, and therefore doubt doesn't enter into the equation. In this method, there was a consistency, whereas it was an inconsistency, seemingly, based on ignorance of what doubt is, that motivated modern philosophy to want to conquer doubt systematically. So he preferred the Greek skeptics to modern thought that tries to overcome doubt. Hegel, specifically, is really who he's pointing this all attention on, if you haven't picked up on that already, right? Trying to conquer doubt and just say move right through. He says, no, this isn't the way to overcome that. Even if the system were absolutely perfect, even if the actuality exceeded the advanced reports, doubt would still not be overcome. It only begins, for doubt is based on interest, and all systematic knowledge is disinterested. The truth, as it were, systematic knowledge is things like mathematics. It simply is. Being a good mathematician is simply recollecting the truth. It's not interest and your engagement with that. And therefore, this is the problem that Kierkegaard sees with it. From this, it is apparent that doubt is the beginning of the highest form of existence, because it can have everything else as its presupposition. When you are now doubting, you're assuming the truth of something, but you're also relating that to you, and therefore your existence is something of a higher nature. The Greek skeptics perceive so exceptionally well that it is unreasonable to speak of doubt when interest is cancelled, but presumably they would have perceived that it is a play on words to speak about an objective doubt. You can't objectively doubt in this same way, because doubt is always over your relation with it, right? Let ideality and reality be in conflict forever and a day. As long as there's no consciousness, no interest, no consciousness that has an interest in this struggle, there is no doubt. But let them be reconciled, and doubt can continue just as actively. Right? So what we have is that we are relating to notions of doubt, or even notions of faith, when you are being placed in relation to it. Doubt is, in some ways, a reflection on these categories of your mind that you have. That those conscious reflection categories, right, that we talked about with Kant. But doubt is now when you are subjectively addressing these categories. Consciousness, then, is the relation, a relation whose form is a contradiction. All right, now again, we're getting paradoxes at play, liking to make this a little more difficult than maybe it seems to be on first blush, right? How does consciousness discover this contradiction? If the fallacy discussed above could remain, that ideality and reality and all naivete communicated with one another, consciousness would never emerge, for consciousness emerges precisely through the collision, just as it presupposes this collision. When do your thoughts exist? Not with the truth that's outside of you, but now when your apprehension, your consciousness hits the actual item, right? That's when you're now there. It's when these things are all colliding. Immediately, there is no collision, right? But mediately, it is present. When it's being mediated, that is when this is present. As soon as the question of a repetition arises, the collision is present, for only a repetition of what has been before is conceivable. Your thought is always on what has been there before and relating to what you're expecting, anticipating things to be. In reality as such, there is no repetition. This is not because everything is different, not at all. If everything in the world were completely identical, in reality, there would be no repetition because reality is only in the moment. Once again, we encounter this term moment. But again, it's not the moment that we see in other Kierkegaard's works. Like what we saw in chapter 1, it's this other term of moment that is used in Hegel's works. So we have a distinction here, a division here. The notion of becoming is really what this moment is. It's a transition of coming to being or a ceasing of being. This is what moments are. Moments are things that come into existence and then fall out of existence. It's all transitions. Moments are not fixed things, but they're fluid things. If the world, instead of being beauty, were nothing but equally large, unvariegated boulders, there would still be no repetition. Even if everything was the same over and over and over again, this isn't repetition, because moments are fluid in this way. Throughout all eternity, in every moment, I would see a boulder, but there would be no question as to whether it was the same one I had seen before. In ideality alone, there is no repetition, for the idea is and remains the same, and as such, it cannot be repeated. Ideas, these categories in our mind, are not being repeated. There's no relation to it. You have the notion of a tree, and as much as we discuss the idea of a tree, its existence in your mind is still the same. The idea of tree exists as it is. The difference is then how you're going to relate to that or bring that into relation to the broader world. That is now when this idea is in relation to something else. In ideality alone, he says, there is no repetition, for the idea is and remains the same, and as such it cannot be repeated. When ideality and reality touch each other, then repetition occurs. When you have the idea of a tree encountering a tree, then you can have a repetition. Then you can say, this is indeed the same tree, or a different tree. There is a quality of this tree, etc., etc. When, for example, Johannes says, when I see something in the moment, ideality enters in and will explain that it is a repetition. Here is the contradiction, though. For that which is also in another mode. That the eternal is, and I see. But in the same instant, I bring it into relation with something that also is, something that is in the same, and that also will explain the other is the same. So now we've got this sort of different relation than even what Plato or Aristotle addressed. It's not the realm of ideas versus the realm of reality, but it's the relation of these two, that they're being smashed into each other. And we're not understanding the material world to then get to the ideas, or the ideas to therefore explain the material world, but they're always in relation to each other. It's always in the combining of these two. It's not one versus the other, or one to the other, but together that we're then led to this third idea, and that is again through subjectivity into relation to it. And that is where the notion of doubt exists and perceives and advances. That here is a redoubling. Here it is a matter of repetition. Ideality and reality therefore collide. Again, we could even use the terms, the realm of ideas versus the material world, or the real world, instead of ideality and reality, if we're wanting to put it into the sort of debate between Plato and Aristotle. But it collides. It's now struck together. And how does this happen? In what medium? It says in time. That is indeed an impossibility. In eternity, that too is an impossibility. What then? In consciousness. There is the contradiction. It's in your mind that these things are brought together and you relate to them. The question is not disintegrated, as if one asked whether all existence is not an image of the idea, and that extent, whether visible existence is not, in a certain volatilized sense, the repetition. Here the question is more specifically one of a repetition in consciousness, consequently of recollection. Recollection involves the same contradiction. Recollection is not ideality. It is ideality that has been. Okay, so it's now what your thoughts are combined with that event that it actually was, that moment, that becoming, and now no longer. This is what recollection is. It is not reality. It is reality that has been. It's not the thing itself, but it's that idea of what has already passed, that moment, which again is a double contradiction. For ideality, according to its concept, has been, and the same holds true of reality according to its concept. So, in reality, recollection is ideality that has been, and reality that has been. Recollection is your mind, through these categorizations, imposing your thought in relation to these things that have been. That is what recollection is. This was a very odd ending, especially for a work that's supposed to be a narrative. We're kind of left with a moment that is ended, that has ceased. And we're now, just through the act of recollection, trying to draw out what that meaning was. Was this an actuality or ideality, right? What is this sort of thing as we're moving forward with the notion of doubting in and of itself? We're left thinking the work was unfinished, and in fact that's because it kind of was. This chapter had section A and not a section B or C or anywhere else. We got to the second part where we're actually getting to engage in doubt, and then it ends. In many ways, this is just as poetic as a letdown as what Johannes was experiencing himself. When he said, why is it these people who have doubted? Why do I not hear this? Why do I not get the path laid out in front of me? Why didn't I get more? Why didn't you tell me what the result of your doubting was, that I can proceed and advance also? We don't get that. Now, we can go to the supplement. We could turn to page 260 and go through 266 and see a couple of other places where this work would have gone if it indeed was completed. We can see that the notion of repetition that he was talking about is there even with notions of doubt, right? That doubt can't be broken off because, again, we're still assuming this notion of repetition. He talks about the actuality of repetitions and notions of illusions on another note, or that the expression of the relation between the immediacy and mediacy is in the repetition. It's the doing of it again and again, and that this is where we're actually encountering this, is the subjective coming from your perspective, but reliving these things and re-engaging with them, and that this is the way thought actually takes place. He says here that the first expression of the relation between immediacy and mediacy is in repetition. In immediacy, there is no repetition. It may be thought to depend on the dissimilarity of all things, not at all, right? If the world is all identical, and we see this in his notes. He continues in the unwriting section of wanting to talk about what your cognition is and what your thoughts are, addressing issues of ignorance and uncertainty and how your mind works and all of these relations, which would have been helpful to advance in on this, especially when we're trying to draw these connections with others. He continues by proposing, at least in his sketch, that he might talk about how different people then relate with one another, as if everything is from the subjective, where are you in my subjective experience and where am I in your subjective experience? If we're both addressing each other from where we are, do you exist or not? We could definitely draw some parallels here with discussions that Berkeley or others would have on the same sort of topic, and that he would have likely hoped to engage with Aristotle and Epicurus and Descartes and Spinoza a little bit more than he did throughout the larger work, but he never quite fully got there. And trying to also figure out what can deceive and what do you do when your sensations are wrong, or your experiences are wrong, or ideas are wrong, not true. And we'd probably be able to draw some more parallels here within pragmatism as well. And he asks also in the sketch, is it an act of cognition, ignorance, uncertainty? How do I come to begin? How do I come to stop? Can cognition deceive? And this, again, he would have had a little bit more on that, but he didn't get there. He also lays out on 262 different categories of relation: ignorance, uncertainty, and doubt. That ignorance is your ignorance, that you do not doubt because you're also not in relation to something. Uncertainty, that you leave an issue alone entirely, more apathetic than just being uncertain about it. You're not sure about whether one thing exists or not, and you just kind of leave it alone. You're not engaged with it, and doubt becomes a higher element of uncertainty. It's not apathy, but it's now engaged apathy, engaged ignorance, right? That you determine your relation to this thing, right? And you do this differently than uncertainty, where you just kind of let things go, where you're more apathetic of it. And he would have addressed this. And of course, how does all of this work? Is it acts of will? Trying to relate this again to notions of Hegel and Spinoza, or drawing also for more works from the Skeptics. He also didn't advance more ideas that we would have expected in the second part. We would have expected with a chapter that we would have gotten a subsequent chapter. And here, the beginnings of what chapter 2 would have been was to, what is it to doubt everything? De omnibus datium est, right? Asking that question. How is it you're going to relate to the idea of doubting everything? Specifically, he would have been bringing in the skeptics at this point. But again, he didn't finish this category either. Chapter 3 of what it would have been was Johannes actually beginning to doubt himself. Doubt notions of sensation, the historical relations of other people, drawing out from the skeptics and seeing what could be used in this way, and then also even asking questions about sensation and doubting mathematical knowledge or philosophical knowledge or religious knowledge, and the different categories that these have, as we already saw with the discussion of what is the person who advances a mathematical proof. What do we expect out of them? What do we expect out of somebody who advances this in a philosophical or religious one? That we're going to expect different things depending on these different categories, different authority to be able to proclaim one or another. And so where is your relation in doubting this? Do you have authority, or are you able to doubt without authority? Would have likely been the aim of these discussions. And then goes off a little bit more in the title of what chapter 4 would have been, that Johannes comes to pure being, but cannot come back again. That he becomes almost afraid of himself, it says in the notes here in the supplements on 264, as if he had had a bad conscience, although he had indeed done no evil. That he had become cunning, crafty as a schemer. In his daily conversation, could not resist saying and doing and apparently thinking what others thought, and yet also had a private opinion about it. That he couldn't come back, he couldn't return to this, we see in his notes about what this would have been, because he had used all of his energy to get to this radical point of doubt. And how is it you can move at this point? And we would have enjoyed maybe seeing a little bit more about that. And then another part would have emerged where Johannes would have philosophized with the helps of traditional studies. He would have engaged his own acts of philosophy now, taking on the works of Hegel, Kant, Spinoza, and Descartes, and engaged with them and developed his own thoughts. And mentioning here that he would have regretted that he didn't begin immediately with Descartes, all the more so because he recalls that Hegel praises Descartes for his childlike and simple exposition. But that was precisely why he didn't begin, because it sounded like sarcasm by Hegel, who certainly was a long way from praising the childlike and the simple, who in other passages says of Descartes that with him nothing more was begun. We can even add other discussions about Hegel and his not liking childlike. And Hegel had his fantastic debate with Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher's conception of religion was this absolute or utter dependence upon God. And that this is the act of religion, is this feeling of absolute dependence. Hegel tried to kind of lampoon Schleiermacher a little bit and said in this case that my dog would be the most religious creature around, as he is absolutely dependent upon me. And, that's not a bad one from Hegel, but it doesn't like this sort of appeal that Schleiermacher had, and the two of them had a long-standing debate, which is its own fun extra category to get into. But we would have been looking at Hegel's relation to Descartes at this point, and this sort of innocence of engagement to move forward with all of that. That we would have retired the issue of doubt, possibly, and tried to figure out what value you can have moving forward with that, and also connecting it with notions of freedom, which was absolutely essential for both Kant and Hegel and others, that these are all freely done acts, and you as the subjective agent have your notions of freedom. That Descartes himself in 266 would have taught notions of wonder, and that we would have had this sort of advantage to engage with this and likely connect back to notions of philosophical fragments. But we didn't get these. We don't know what that is, and it works well for the scope and the aim of what we have done, that it ends when it does. That Johannes Climacus's journey begins, but we never get all the way there. We never arrive at the conclusion. So what do we learn if we never fully arrive at our conclusion? Johannes Climacus, St. John of the Ladder, who at the very beginning talks about notions of doubt being this ladder of divine ascent, that thought itself was climbing this ladder. Now, he just began to think himself. He just began to doubt and engage. And then the work ends. So where are we on this ladder? How high up did we get? We clearly didn't make it all the way to paradise. We didn't make it to the end. Johannes is still a young philosopher by the time this work ends. Relating this again to the actual St. John of the Ladder, who is asked to write his ladder of divine ascent at the end of his life. What happens if you're trying to write a memoir before your life has begun, or at the very first stages of the actual act, instead of at the end? There's two radically different approaches to the same sort of topic. One is the act of becoming, while the other is recollection, and possibly a becoming through that. But we didn't get all the way to the paradise of thought itself, but we definitely touched on quite a number of different themes throughout this second work, Johannes Climacus. We clearly have the notion of doubt and the value of doubt, one way or the other, and engage easily with Descartes. We also see a very not so veiled critique of Hegel and Hegel's notions of doubt and thought and his notion of idealism, which Kierkegaard kind of eliminated in his arguments, in his perspective, and advanced notions of existentialism. That this is supposed to be a hard feat, but it also begins with notions of the subjective. We, of course, also encountered a few other philosophers along the way, that it wasn't just Hegel and Descartes, but we open up with a quote from Spinoza. And we include, obviously, the larger debate between the empiricists and the rationalists. We definitely get quite a few notions of apprehension brought in and can discuss Bonaventure and others along these ways. We definitely have different notions of truth and its relation to you, and how in one moment it might be untruth. And we could draw out some connections here with pragmatists, both James as well as even notions of Peirce, as this was connected in grammar, in language, in the expression of things. And of course, addressing truth through language and words, we're thinking of nominalism and thinking of Occam and the other nominalists as well. We definitely have an engagement with Plato and Aristotle and looking at things differently depending on how we would like to address these. We also very clearly have notions of Kant laid out through this whole work, and that it's also the process, as we mentioned very early on in the first introduction to this work, that this whole thing is about the process and not necessarily just about the journey. And we have connections here with both Emerson and Dostoevsky, that sometimes it's the journey that itself has the value where we need to move forward. And so we found ourselves on this journey where we got to take a lot of little moments to stop and analyze and engage the sights that we saw on the sides of this road. That we had the three theses, that philosophy begins with doubt, that in order to philosophize one must have doubted, and modern philosophy begins with doubt. And we realized at the end of all of this that they're all saying the same thing, that in order to philosophize one must have doubted, because everything has to be begun with the subjective, according to Kierkegaard, and that this is how we need to move forward and proceed with this idea. Now again, this wasn't done effortlessly. There was a lot of strain and confusing moments, but we got there. We've concluded. And so what are your concluding thoughts? What are your takeaways from this work? How are you expressing Kierkegaard to yourself through reflection? What's your engagement with this? And which one of these ideas are letting you now do the hard work of becoming a philosopher yourself and engaging in doubt and beginning this journey on your own, because that is only the way that it can be done, through this distancing, following this act of becoming from the image and likeness of what we saw with Saint Irenaeus and others.